Hello my loves, my name is Hannah and welcome to my channel. We are today getting ready for the start of June being Pride Month, at least in the UK. June is Pride Month, and I thought it would be good to do a kind of hybrid video of some recommendations of some books that I have read with really great queer representation, and also a little bit of a TBR. So there's kind of three themes that are going to run through this video. So recommendations, books that I have read, TBR, which is not strictly, if you've been on my channel before, you know that I don't do very well with like a strict TBR. I very rarely set myself an official TBR challenge, and so these are all books that are like on my radar. If I say that on my TBR, it means I want to get to them at some point, not I promise you that I am going to read this book in June, because I can promise you now I'm not going to read all these books in June. But I thought I'd tell you about them in case you were looking for some recommendations and if any of them are of interest. And then at the end we're going to chat about some books that just some pals of mine have recommended. And also, as I've done this, I've gone through this process of kind of compiling some of these books, I've noticed some gaps. So at the end, I'm going to ask for some recommendations from you too. So this is a mutual relationship, right? You can't be all take. I need your recommendations too. I'm going to go through genre by genre, and I'm gonna, if you're new here, if you've landed on this video and you've never seen any of my content before, I read predominantly literary fiction, contemporary fiction, classics, predominantly. So what you're not going to get here is tons of contemporary romance, tons of fantasy, science fiction, that sort of stuff. I like some of those genres, I just don't read tons of them. So that is a disclaimer now to say that we're going to skew heavily towards certain genres, okay? Final other health warning, I have close to 70 books that I will be mentioning in this video, and I don't want to be here for hours and hours, and I'm sure you don't want to be here for hours and hours. So forgive me in advance if I rattle through some of these titles and if I'm not giving you tons of information about them or like full reviews for the books that I've read, because we don't have time. I am going for quantity over quality today. Forgive me. Normally I allow myself to really chat on, as you can probably tell from this introduction. And now, let's talk about the books. The first sort of genre we're going to look at is classics. And actually the first three of these titles are books that I read or talk about in more depth in other videos on my channel. So I will link them down below. I will also have the titles of every book that I mention in the order that I mention it in the description box down below. So like you don't need to grab a pen, okay? I mean, you can if you want, but I'll put them in the description box, don't worry. So the first one is The Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers. This is the second book I've read by Carson McCullers. She was writing in America in mostly the 40s and 50s, so kind of mid 20th century, and she writes sort of rural settings, family dramas, coming of age, really, really well. So recommend that. I read that in my most recent reading vlog that was on my channel, I put on my channel last week. The next one is A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood. This is a really beautiful novella almost. It's quite short, and it is one day in one man's life in the aftermath of his partner, his male partner, dying. So it's a book that is very introspective. It's very much about grief. Christopher Isherwood is a beautiful writer, and yeah, I really recommend that. And I also really recommend the film adaptation with Colin Firth. Then this is probably my favourite classic queer book, and it's one that if you've been on my channel for a little while, you know that I'm like on a bit of a mission to make more people read this book, and it is I Will Not Serve by Eveline Mahyere. I don't even think it's in print anymore. Beg your libraries to try and find a copy of it. It's a beautiful coming of age book, translated from the French, mid 20th century, following a young woman who falls in love with her teacher who is a nun. Loved it. And I reread that book last year or the year before, but I vlogged the whole experience, so if you want to know more about that, I will link that video down below. And finally, of the books that I have read and recommend, it's an absolute classic, but Orlando by Virginia Woolf, which, do I need to tell you about Orlando? I probably don't need to tell you about Orlando, right? It's Virginia Woolf, it's Orlando. And then some books that are like vaguely on my TBR, from some classic authors, is Maurice by E.M. Forster. That is up there. That is one of, I think, the only book that he wrote that was sort of openly queer, I think. Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. I definitely will be reading that in June because I'm about to go and pick up my copy from the library, so we will definitely be reading Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. Carol by Patricia Highsmith, which I think a lot of people know from the film adaptation with Kate Blanchett and Rooney Mara. I don't have a copy of that. I don't think I'll be getting to that one soon, but that, I mean, I've been really enjoying reading some Patricia Highsmith over the last year or so, so I'm looking forward to getting to that one very soon. And then one that is relatively new on my radar is The Hidden Path by Elena Fortún, and this is a bit like the Eveline Mahyere. This is a bit of a forgotten classic. It was unpublished in her lifetime. I think the author died in the 50s, and this book I think was only published for the first time in 2016. I think it is a strongly autobiographical literary fiction book, I think, and I think it's bisexual, which is the reason that it popped up on my radar, because I was going through Everand desperate to find bisexual things, because that's my flavour of the rainbow. So that's it for classics. Obviously, I think it goes without saying, this will not be an exhaustive list of books in these genres. It's just ones that I've read that I've liked and ones that are on my radar. I am not at all suggesting that there are not more queer classics, but by all means feel free to go and drop your recommendations for any of these genres in the comments down below. And in fact, any genre that I sort of skip or miss over, if you read a lot of that, help anyone out below who's looking for some of those recommendations. Let's crowdsource this, guys, come on. So the next genre that I'm going to talk about is historical fiction, which I don't read like tons and tons of, but I almost always enjoy it when I do. So it's one that I want to read more of, and I particularly enjoy queer historical fiction because, you know, for obvious reasons. So I've got a few that I've read and enjoyed. There's a couple that are more kind of like recent historical, like 20th century. So the first one is Swimming in the Dark by Tomasz Jedrowski. This is, I'm doing a whole separate Euros reading challenge. It's a long story, more information coming in upcoming videos. But I needed to read a book from Poland, and this is the Polish book that I picked. And this follows two young boys who fall in love in the post-war period in Poland, and follows their story. I really enjoyed it. It is a debut, and I think you can tell that it was a debut, but I still liked it. I would recommend it if you're looking for a kind of like queer historical fiction. I read my very first Sarah Waters last winter. I know, I can't believe I haven't read it before. So I read Tipping the Velvet, and actually that is also linked in a reading blog, which I will link down below. And I loved it. I loved her writing style. It was this big, sweeping sort of Victorian romance. I really, really, really enjoyed it. And I've been looking to get to more Sarah Waters in the future. And then the last one that I'm going to talk about is Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. This is a book that took me so completely by surprise, because I don't know why, but I just didn't think I was going to like this book. This is a sort of split narrative historical fiction book that has one line where we're following a woman who is trying to become the first female pilot to circumnavigate the globe, and then in the present day an actress who is getting ready to play her in a film. And I don't know, I didn't think it was going to be for me, but oh my, I loved this book. I loved this book so much, I will reread this book. And I don't do a lot of rereading, so. So that's it for recommendations. There are more, I know. Let's just assume that at the end of all of these sections, I'm saying, I know there's more. I know there's more. But I do have a bunch that are on my TBR in some guise or another. Again, some that I'm very much planning on reading imminently, and some that I'll get to when I get to. The first is The New Life by Tom Crewe. This has been everywhere, this book. It's been up for awards, it's won awards. It's following a male couple in the 20th century, I think, while homosexuality was illegal in the UK. So I'm looking forward to getting to that one soon. The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue. Emma Donoghue, I have only read Room by, and I know that Room is a bit of an outlier in her sort of body of work, and that she mostly does historical fiction, so I'm really looking forward to that one. That is a sort of, I think is it Sapphic and something to do with nurses or midwives in the 20th century, maybe? And then I said I wanted to read more Sarah Waters. I have on my shelf, where is she? Fingersmith, it's just there, which I is one that I am planning on getting to soon. If you have seen the film The Handmaiden, which is an excellent film, this is the book that it's based on, although this I think is set in London, whereas The Handmaiden moves it to Japan. Then a Bosnian book that I've been meaning to get to for ages. I bought a copy of this in hardback, and I think it's about to come out in paperback, which is so annoying. The World and All That It Holds by Aleksandar Hemo. This is a Bosnian book which follows two men, I think, at the outbreak of the war. So I think it's set in Sarajevo, I think, at like in the immediate aftermath of Franz Ferdinand's assassination, I think. And then I have this book here, which is Man-Eating Typewriter by Richard Milward. This is a more sort of recent historical fiction, I think. This is set in the 80s. Maybe it's a bit earlier than that. But this I'm really interested in getting to. It has had such mixed views. I think it is a very divisive book, but I'm really interested because it is at least part written in Polari, which, if you're not familiar, is in the UK a sort of slang language that's like a mixture of lots of different things, like rhyming slang, but also has a lot of Roma influences, and it was used a lot by queer people in the 20th century, I think, to speak to each other without sort of like outing themselves in public. You get what I mean? So yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading that. And then the last one is Fellow Travellers by Tomasz Mallon. And this one, I don't know much about at all, except that it's set in the 50s, and I think is it something to do with the CIA? But the reason this is on my radar is because there is a series adaptation coming out soon. It may already be out. I think it's coming out soon, with Matt Bomber and Jonathan Bailey in it. So I want to read the book, because then I want to watch the series. That's all there is to that. Next up, genre-wise, we have literary fiction, which is by far the genre that I read the most of. And so we've got the most recommendations here. What I have vaguely done, because I'm very aware that literary is a real spectrum. And so I've started with kind of the ones that I think are potentially not even the most challenging, but that are very much literary in the sense that they're doing something very innovative with the way that the story is being told and written, through to, I guess, slightly more commercial literary fiction. But like, obviously, where I still think the writing is very good. You go, let's just go. The first one is a book that I really enjoyed but that I don't think I understood, and that is Love and Other Thought Experiments by Sophie Ward. This is really a series of interconnected short stories that follows a family, 2 women and their son, but each story or chapter is playing with a particular thought experiment or kind of philosophical idea, so it's incredibly esoteric and intellectual. And there were some stories that I loved and some imagery that has really stayed with me, and some where I just didn't quite feel smart enough. But if you're up for a kind of intellectual challenge, give it a go. I really liked it. But yeah, like I said, don't ask me to have an in-depth conversation with you about it, because I will not be able to. I mean, don't ask me to do that about any book after I've read it, because I will have forgotten. My handle is Hannah Lost the Plot for a reason. The next one is Nadezhda in the Dark by Jelena Moskowicz. This is a Ukrainian novel written in verse. I talked about this in my April reading wrap-up, and it is a very sort of intimate portrait of 2 women who are in a relationship, and they're just sitting next to each other on a bed, but running through the speaker's mind. So one of the women's minds is sort of their whole history, and you get a lot of conversations about mental health, about identity, about cultural identity, particularly because these are because the speaker is from the Ukrainian diaspora, so grew up in Ukraine but no longer lives there, and yeah, it was great. I didn't love it, but I think it was really interesting. So, but now 2 books that I really did love. Shuggie Bain and Young Mungo by Douglas Stewart. These are beautifully written literary portraits of young queer working class people. So Shuggie Bain was his debut, and that was brilliant, and followed a young boy called Shuggie growing up. And then Young Mungo is a totally separate story, but is almost like an older version of Shuggie Bain, who's a teenager. And I really loved both of them, but Young Mungo was my favourite. They do have quite a lot of threat in them, and they're they're very sad. So maybe don't go to these if you're looking for joyful, uplifting queer books. But actually, having said that, I don't know how many of these would be described as joyful and uplifting. So joyful and uplifting queer books in the comments down below, please, folks. But yeah, I loved both of them. Then, in a kind of similar vein, in terms of exploring sort of working class identity and queerness, is a book that I read this year by Andrew McMillan, which is Pity. This is his debut novel, and I really enjoyed it. It's a kind of multi-generational story, very much about local identities, but a huge amount of queerness being explored through that as well. Lots of repeated imagery of surveillance and layers. It was beautiful. And then a book that I read very recently, and I think I talked about this in the same video as I spoke about The Member of the Wedding by Carson McCullers. This is Boulder by Ava Balthazar. It's the first book by Ava Balthazar I've read, but I will definitely be getting to more. This is about a young woman who lives this incredibly independent life. She is a cook on a freighter ship, not like a cruise ship, basically what's the word I want? I'm very tired today, folks, and I'm filming this on the day that it's going up on my channel, so forgive me if I'm a little flustered. But yeah, she works on a ship, the word for which I cannot describe, and she lives this very untethered existence, and then she falls in love with a woman who wants to tether her, basically, and it's about a relationship where 2 people love each other very much, but have very different ideas of how they want to live, and it's very, very short and very, very beautifully written. I loved it. speaking of beautifully written, and I loved it, Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. I mean, this bit, I mean, I feel stupid putting it on. It won the Polari Prize, so like, if you're looking for queer books, I think you will have come across this book before. But this is like, particularly in like my particular queer group of friends, this is like one of the most universally beloved books because I think it's got lots of different elements going on. I loved it for its literary, beautiful writing and explorations of like characters and relationships, but there's also body horror elements of it. It's got a slight kind of sci-fi dystopian thing happening in it. It is about two women who are married, one of whom works on a submarine and her submarine disappears for a really long time and they assume that she's dead, and then she comes back one day and she does not come back right, and it's beautiful. Speaking of beautiful, the next book is Sunburn by Chloe Michelle Howarth. I feel like this is one of the books that I talk about all the time, and I really, really loved it. This is set in Ireland in the 90s. It is a coming of age sort of first queer love story. It made me bawl my eyes out. I would describe this book, and I do this with a pinch of salt because I have only seen the TV adaptation of Normal People. I have not read Normal People by Sally Rooney, but this is giving sapphic Normal People. Oh my god. The next book is Memorial by Brian Washington. I didn't love this book, but I thought it was really interesting in the way that follows two men who are in a relationship, and the mother of one is coming to stay with them, but they haven't had a conversation about that. And I think his mother is one of them Japanese and one is African American, I think. So there's really interesting like cultural things as well as like family relationships and dynamics, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. It didn't stay with me as much as some of the other books have, but I really enjoy Brian Washington's writing. I even liked mostly his short story collection, and I don't do short stories, so. The next one is English Animals by Laura Kay. This is about a young woman who goes to work at this big house in the country, and she thinks she's going to be like an au pair, but when she gets there, there's no children, and it's about the relationship that she has with this married couple, and it's got a lot of taxidermy in it. Then another family drama that I absolutely loved and read quite recently is Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo. This follows a man in his 70s who has been in a secret relationship with his best friend Maurice for since they were teenagers. But he is also married to a woman and has children and has basically been living a double life for his entire life. And the book starts with the sort of question of whether or not he is finally willing to sort of come out and publicly be queer. And oh, I loved it. I thought it was, all of the characters were so complex. It reminded me a lot of like how Zadie Smith writes families. It was and then Detransition Baby by Tori Peters. I ate this book up when I read it last summer. I think it's like a really good summer read, not because it's set during the summer, but like for it was just so like you could have read it in a one-er. It's following a sort of awkward love triangle, featuring, as you might be able to tell from the title, a detransitioned man, so a man who used to identify as a trans woman and is now reverted back and identifies as a cisgendered man, and it's like gnarly and difficult, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. And then finally, two recommendations by the same author if you are looking for really sort of engaging, funny, literary fiction, but that still kind of packs a punch and asks a lot of questions. I really like Emily Austen for this. I loved Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead more, which is the first of her books that I read, but I also read her most recent release, which is Interesting Facts About Space. They both deal a lot with sort of very specifically with queer identities and trauma, shame, closeting, but in a very kind of funny way. I really like Emily Austen, so that's it for the recommendations.
Hannah, how the hell did I not mention any Ali Smith? How to Be Both by Ali Smith. How to Be Both. Say hi to my former lunch.
And then some that are on my TBR, I've kept this quite short because like half my TBR is literary fiction and probably at least half of that is queer. So I could talk about so many books, but I'm just going to mention Julia Armfield's new book. That is coming out in a couple of weeks in the middle of Pride Month. That's Private Rights, and this I think is a sort of climate dystopian queer book. I think the premise is that it hasn't stopped raining in like a really long time. So like basically like whatever we've done to the planet, now it just rains permanently. And you know, she wrote about water beautifully in Our Wives Under the Sea. So I'm looking forward to that one. I have After Sappho by Selby Wynne Schwartz on my list. I don't know if this would count as historical or literary, but my understanding is that it's sort of reflections on different queer writers throughout history, but it's a novel. Did I get that right? It was shortlisted or longlisted for the Women's Prize a couple of years ago. And I picked it up and it's been sat on my shelf, so I need to get to it at some point. Then one that I will be getting to soon is Mrs. S by Kay Patrick. This is set in a boarding school that is based on the boarding school that my best friend went to. And my best friend Farmer, who you may recognise if you've watched any of my like book to screen adaptation videos, she features in those. She actually was on the lacrosse team with this author. So I am reading this mostly because she says it's a very accurate portrayal of the school. So I'm looking forward to that. And then the last one has been on my list for ages, and that is Johnny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead. This is a author by an Indigenous American author, and it's the main character is Two-Spirit, and I have never read a book with that representation in before, I don't think, or at least not where it was a central part of it. So yeah, I'm looking forward to getting to that one. And then I didn't know what to call this section because it's basically like other fiction that isn't any of the genres I've spoken about. And to me, I call it having a silly fun time. And I don't mean that at all in a disparaging way. It's a silly little fun time book. And I have a few recommendations for those and a couple on my TBR. So essentially kind of like cozier vibes, lower stakes, warm little gay hug is the vibe. So firstly, Lex Croucher. I've read Infamous by Lex Croucher, but they've got like quite a few titles now, and it's my turn to school brag, but I went to the same school as Lex Croucher. I was about 4 or 5 years above them though, but I remember them. Yeah, so they're kind of, Infamous is a sort of Regency era, like Jane Austen vibe, but they're very funny, and they do like historical sort of different historical settings. I have, like I said, I haven't read others by them, but they've got one that's like like an Arthurian legend vibe. They've got one that is like their latest one. I don't actually know if it's out yet. Is Not for the Faint of Heart, and that's like Robin Hood, but gay. I mean, but gayer, because I mean, we all know why those merry men were merry. Then a couple of sort of comics and graphic novels. I feel stupid recommending Heartstopper. If you haven't heard of Heartstopper, literally, I mean, if you're watching this video and you haven't heard of Heartstopper, just stop watching me and go watch that adorable show immediately. And yeah, the Heartstopper comics are brilliant and a very heartwarming, lovely time. And then Cosmonauts by Hannah Templar, which I've still only read volume 1 of. I'm not a big graphic novel or comic reader, but we read this for a queer book club that I was in. And it's yeah, like a gaze in space vibe, and it was a fun, silly time. I don't know what else to tell you. And then a couple that I'm planning on reading soon is another Alice Oseman, Radio Silence. So I have read a few Alice Osemans, other than Heartstopper. I don't love them as much as Heartstopper, but they are like the only YA that I will read. Like, if Alice Oseman's written it, I will read it, but I only read their work. I don't know why that they're the exception to the rule, but I'm pretty allergic to YA in almost all other circumstances, except for Alice Oseman. So I've borrowed Radio Silence off a friend of mine, and oh, I missed a book! I haven't actually finished this yet. I've got about an hour left of the audiobook, but I have been eating up Herc by Phoenicia Rogerson, which is a Greek myth retelling of Hercules, in which Hercules is a very silly bisexual man. And it is not like the greatest thing I've ever read. It's certainly not one of the best myth retellings, but I am having such a fun time with it. It's got like the audiobook has like a full cast. It splits into like multiple different POVs. You get all these different aspects of Hercules's life, so not just the sort of 12 labours bit, but it has been delightful. So I recommend that. And then the final one on my silly fun time is Good Omens, which I know, I suspect if it's anything like the series, is more like implied gay, but in my headcanon and in everyone's headcanon, Aziraphale and Crawley are so gay that I'm counting it as a gay book. And I think Neil and Terry would agree. I think they would agree. So that is it for now for fiction. We're going to jump and talk about some non-fiction real quick, and then we'll come back to some recommendations from my pals, and finally some requests. Although, I mean, you've probably already noted some of the absences here, so you know, the request's probably not going to come as a surprise to you. So first up, and again, I've kind of ranked these from like most non-fiction-y in terms of like, this is an informative, sort of not academic, but you know, very much non-fiction, through to like some more sort of accessible non-fiction, if non-fiction is not really your genre. So we have The Pink Line, The World's Queer Frontiers by Mark Geverser. This is looking, taking a kind of global look at queer identities now, a bit historically, but looking at how queer identities are used as political, or become political fodder, and the various ways that that presents differently in different countries, and a lot about like different rights. So there's a lot about like trans rights, which I mean here in the UK and in other countries is the latest football that is being kicked around, and yeah, it's it was really, really interesting. I listened to the audio and I wish I'd read it in either a digital or a physical copy, because I think I would have retained it a little bit better. But I do recommend it if you're kind of interested in like queer politics. Then a couple of trans history books. So I read Female Husbands by Jen Mannion, and this is looking at well, we don't know if they were trans men or if they were sort of cis women who were choosing to present male because it was the only way that they could marry the women that they loved. But either way, marriages between two people who were assigned female at birth, but where one is presenting as male, and it goes through a few different examples of that from history. And it was really interesting in the way it talks about transing gender, because obviously it's really hard to find the appropriate language to talk about these people, because they're obviously historical figures and we don't know how they would have identified themselves, like whether they would have identified as trans men or whether they would have identified as lesbians, like it. But it was really interesting. It didn't like blow me away, but again, if it's something that you're interested in, it was an interesting read. And ditto The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes, or Forbes, I think it's pronounced, by Zoe Playden. This is looking more at one specific case of a trans man and how that case has ricocheted through British legal history. It was real interesting. Then we have more sort of memoir style things. We have obviously, and I talk about this in other books where in other videos where I'm recommending queer books, but the love letters between Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville West. So not really a memoir, but you know, published letters. I really, really loved this. I think I've reread it a couple of times, or at least like dipped in and out of it. I mean, two really beautiful writers writing really beautiful gay things to each other. Then In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This is sort of an incredibly like literary and poetic memoir, but it is dealing with domestic abuse in a queer relationship. So like big content warning for that. But it was absolutely beautifully written. And then the last memoir, I really enjoyed Knocking Myself Up by Michelle T, which is all about, as you might be able to tell from the title, her trying to get pregnant, but it also talks a lot about her queer identities and her various partners' identities and stuff, but it's a much more informal style than some of the others. Then we have, if you just want a really accessible, useful queer history, I recommend Queer: A Graphic History by Dr. Meg John Barker and Jules Scheel. This didn't go into as much depth as I would have liked, but it is also a graphic history, so like very much my problem. But it is a really good, useful kind of overview, and done in a really kind of accessible format, so I recommend that. And then an essay collection, if you want sort of like funny essays that examine social issues, but also like a lot of pop culture. I loved Girls Can Kiss Now by Jill Gurwitz. It was like real funny, really clever, really witty. Recommend. So they're my recommendations for nonfiction. And then I have a couple of books that are on my vague TBR. One that I really would like to read this month, because it has been on my shelf for ages, is by Julia Shaw, which is a history, the hidden history, culture and science of bisexuality. I think we all just need to know the title of that book to know what that book's about. And then this was actually recommended by my friend Helen, but I've added it to my TBR, so I'm not putting it in the recommendations section. I'm putting it in my TBR. This is A Bookshop of One's Own, How a Group of Women Set Out to Change the World by Jane Cholmsley. And let me just read you. The captivating true story of an underdog business, a feminist bookshop founded in Thatcher's Britain from a woman at the heart of the women's liberation movement. What was it like to start a feminist bookshop in an industry dominated by men? How could a lesbian thrive in Thatcher's time with the government legislating to restrict her rights? How do you run a business when your real aim is to change the world? And Helen said it was great. And it's available on Everand. So I was like, yes, I will listen to that. Then after I spoke about how much I enjoyed the Carson McCullers book in my last video, a couple of people said in the comments that I should read my autobiography of Carson McCullers by Jen Shapland. So this, I think, is a hybrid memoir and biography. So it is in part about Jen trying to write a biography of Carson McCullers, but then I think also elements of their own life too. But it's come very highly recommended, so I'm looking forward to getting to that. And then another sort of blend of autobiography and fiction is La Batarde by Violette Leduc, which is described as an obsessive and revealing self-portrait of a remarkable woman, and that it relates her long search for her own identity through a series of agonising and passionate love affairs. And maybe this also came up on my bisexual search. I think it did. But yeah, so that's a kind of like memoir as well. And then I'm also interested in reading The Waterfront Journals by Daniel Wojnarowicz, which is... So he, if you're not familiar with him, and I don't know tons about him, but he was a visual and performance artist who was a really fierce campaigner during the AIDS crisis in the 80s, and he died really tragically young. And these are some of his really short form kind of like sketch prose that he was writing. He was going around like interviewing different queer people, I think, and sort of like writing these little kind of like mini, you know, kind of like Humans of New York. In my head, that's what this is. I don't know if it's actually what this is, but in my head, that's what this is. So that's the non-fiction, and then a couple of other little bits. I really recommend, if you want to get like an anthology to just like have a little scan through, I really recommend Head of Zeus published Queer, which is a collection of writings from ancient times through to yesterday, I think it's the title, something like that. And it's got loads of different writers from right across the rainbow and across the world as well. And they're just kind of short little excerpts. So some of it's poetry, some of it is extracts from novels, some of it's extracts of non-fiction. And yeah, it's like a good little kind of like, covers a lot of bases, might introduce you to some authors that you particularly like. And then I am planning on reading Bylines, which is a poetry anthology from, oh my goodness, I can't remember which publishing house. Sorry. I made the decision not to pull all of the physical books off of my shelf to do this video because I thought that might make me cry. So I don't have it to hand. It's upstairs with the rest of my poetry collections. But I'm looking forward to getting to that one. I've been enjoying reading more poetry this year, and now feels like a good time for that particular collection. So yeah, all of the poems in there are from poets who identify as bi+. So there's my recommendations / TBR. Very quickly, I'm going to give you some titles from my pals. So they're a bookish bunch, but they read, not everyone has the same sort of, but not everyone has the same reading taste as me, so I can't speak to these books, but I thought I would chuck them in. Anyway, some of them I have heard of and are on my radar. But I basically asked a load of people, like, what was the last queer book you read that you really liked, and like, what are you excited to read soon? So here we are. I'm going to be reading these ones. Sorry. Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, which I had heard of. This is a dystopian book where I think prisoners are made to fight like gladiators in order to win their freedom. Sounds like Hunger Gamesy, but not YA, I think. Then All That's Left in the World by Eric J. Brown, and the sequel, The Only Light Left Burning, which is a post-apocalyptic YA romance. I've seen the cover of this and I really want to read it, but I'm allergic to YA. I don't know why. I told myself last year I wasn't allowed to read any more YA romance because it's not for me and no one benefits. No one benefits. But if you like YA romance, there you go. Metal from Heaven by August Clarke, which is described as, this has got me so interested, a bloody lesbian revenge tale and political fantasy for fans of Gideon the Ninth, which I haven't read, and The Princess Bride. I mean, that sounds excellent. I want to read that book. Neon Roses by Rachel Dawson, I have also added to my TBR after everyone, like 4 people in the group chat were like, oh my god, that was amazing. This is, so if you know the film Pride, about the lesbians and gays support the miners, where like the LGBT group went to, well, the LG group at the time, if we're being historically accurate, went to South Wales to support the miners' strike. This is about that. So I really want to read that. Bellies by Nicola Dinan, which is one that I've seen like all over Bookstagram, and is like a literary romance coming of age. I think that's also going on my TBR, if I'm honest, but I also feel like in my head I'm comparing it too much to Sunburn, and like I feel like that book's got a very special place in my heart, so like it might not benefit from the comparison. And then Learned by Heart by Emma Donoghue, so another Emma Donoghue, which is about 2 girls who fall in love in a boarding school in 18th century York. So we've got that one. Cuckoo by Gretchen Felker Martin, which is a horror. And I couldn't, in my very lazy Google, find out if this is adult horror or YA horror. But it's about a group of queer kids who are trying to survive in a conversion camp from hell. The Z Word by Lindsay King Miller, which I can't remember who, was it Jenny? Jenny, was it you who recommended this? All they said was zombie apocalypse at Pride. So there's that. I mean, I'm surprised Casey McQuiston hasn't come up more, to be honest, but One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. The Balance of Fates by Raquel Raylin, which is a queer romantasy with vampires. The Everland Cycle by J.C. Rycroft, which Megan specifically said, book 2, I think, The Timeless Legion. And that is I think, sapphic and trans fantasy. Is that right? And then finally, Priory of the Orange Tree and A Day of Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon. Now, I feel like this summer is the summer that I read The Priory of the Orange Tree. I feel like this is the summer for that. I will probably regret saying that, but that's what I feel like is happening. And then 2 very quick non-fiction recommendations from the gang. A Trans Man Walks into a Gay Bar by Harry Nichols, which I think is like a quite like hopeful, life-affirming sort of memoir. And Bad Gays, A Homosexual History by Hugh Lemmy and Ben Miller. I think I've listened to a couple of episodes. There's a podcast of this. So it's basically looking at different figures in queer history who are a little complicated and evil. So yeah, I might dip into the podcast a bit more in June and then work out from that if I want to read the book. So that brings me to my requests. I would love some and I'm talking mostly literary and classics here, gang, okay? Because they're my favourite genres. I'm desperate for some non-binary and trans representation. I would love some arrow or ace representation, because I can't, and bisexual rep actually. I feel like I get so angry and annoyed that I don't really like contemporary romance as a genre, because I feel like a lot of the easily accessible, as in like can get them in libraries and like on various like subscription apps or whatever, of queer rep is in those genres, and they're just not genres that I particularly like. So I really want really great trans literary fiction. Have you read a great literary fiction book that's trans? Because I want to read that book. I really want to read that book. So yeah, so there's that in terms of specifically looking for non-binary or genderqueer trans umbrella literary fiction, and bisexual fiction, and arrow ace fiction, and also intersectional identities. I am very, very conscious of how white this list is. So again, recommendations by people of colour who are queer, who have written books that are preferably literary fiction. I will allow historical fiction also, and classics. I beg you, please, please. And I actually think that's all my requests. I think I have enough books to be getting on for now. Wow, 54 minutes. Okay, I've been talking long enough. I hope you've managed to pick up some titles there. Let me know in a comment down below if there's any that you've read that you particularly enjoy. Please let me know your recommendations. And also, if you've added any of these books to your own TBR for Pride Month, then that would be delightful. And obviously, I should have said this up top, but obviously queer books are for all of the months of the year. That goes without saying. So I will be reading these books in June, but also forever. So yeah, please also do that year round. But let me know what's on your TBR for June or for future months. And if you've enjoyed this video, please do give it a little thumbs up. That really helps with the old algorithm. And I will see you soon for something else. My May wrap up, I think. Bye gang. Happy reading.